Okay.
Recording in progress.
We're up to Daf Tzadi Tesamid Beis. Today has a lot of yisaidistic sugyas, yisaidistic halachas in this daf, very much related to kashrus and to bittul, and when things are batal, when things are not batal. So the Mishnah said that if you have a gid anosha that gets mixed in with other sinews that are permissible, the halacha is all the sinews have to be thrown out. Meaning, even if there is 100 sinews, 200 sinews, they're all it's all a problem, and the gid anosha is not batal. And the question is why? Why is the gid anosha not nullified in the majority? Batal b'roiv. So the answer is beria shani. Because the gid anosha is a beria, it's a complete unit, it's a complete isser. Complete isurim are not batal, regardless of the size. That's why a little ant, if it's complete with all its legs and its antenna, whatever, it's not batal regardless of its size, because it's a beria and it has chashivas by the very fact that it's the entire unit that it's not nullified. Then the Mishnah said, similarly, if you have a slice of nevela, a slice of chazer that gets cooked with other, let's say a slice of nevela, let's say that gets cooked with other meat, the halach is also not batal. You have to throw all the pieces out. Same question, v'tibata beruba. Why is this nevela not batal? So you have a piece of a pork chop that gets mixed in with a lot of chicken. I can't tell which one is which. I have to throw all the pieces out. Why? Why is it not nullified b'roiv? Sahanichanas, the Gemara offers two potential possibilities. There is such a concept that when something is not purchased by it's purchased by the unit. Something they used to buy like by the bucket. If you buy something by the bucket, it's not chashiv. However, if you buy it itemized, where you only say, I need 2 of those, that's chashiv. So there's a machlokes. If you have something that is sometimes bought by the item, sometimes bought by the pounds, by the weight, is that chashiv? So if it's exclusively itemized, then it's chashiv. It's not batal. And if it's exclusively purchased by the buckets or by the pound, it's batal. What about something that sometimes is, sometimes isn't? Apparently, pork chops or whatever are sometimes purchased by the itemized and sometimes purchased by the pound. So it's a machlokes. So the Gemara says, if you hold that if it's occasionally purchased by the itemization, that's already enough to say that it's not batal. So then fine, I get why a pork chop is not batal, because it's sometimes purchased by the item. Sometimes you say 2, sometimes you say a bucket. So because sometimes you say 2, then it's chashiv, it's not batal. But if you hold that for it to not be batal, it has to be exclusively purchased by the itemization, pork chops are not. So it should be batal. So the Gemara says a big yisoid. This is a yisoid in halacha called chaticha roi l'skabe. Shani chaticha, the chaticha roi l'skabe l'fnei orchem, which means that if the piece of iser is so large and so chashiv that you would serve it to a guest, meaning it's not a meatball. You maybe serve a meatball to a guest, maybe you don't. You probably don't. But it's a big steak. Something that's so chashiv that you would serve to a guest is not batal. So this whole concept that, isurim are batal b'shishim, it's not so true. Because if the iser is a cowboy steak that you would serve a cowboy steak to a guest, it's not batal. And that's the case of the Mishnah. So you have 2 cases of the Mishnah where there's no bittul. One is the beria of gid anosha, and one is a chaticha roi l'skabed. And the Gemara speaks it out. Sricha, you need both. Diashmin and gibishum beriyahu. You need the case of gid because it's to tell you that a beria is not batal. But I wouldn't know the halacha about a chaticha roi l'skabed. Diashmin chaticha hoiv roi l'skabed gim aloi. Sricha, that's why you need both cases. Okay. New topic. And there's basically 2 sugyas of today. This one and then the next one about isser chal isser. Okay. Let me give a little bit of a background. This is the sugya called chanan. Chanan means it's ches nun strachel nun, which stands for chaticha nasis nevela. Chaticha nasis nevela. What this means is like this: if I have an iser, a piece of chazer, that gets cooked with a heter, piece of heter, there's 2 ways to look at it. You're not going to be able to eat the heter anyway because it got cooked with chazer. There's 2 ways to look at it. You could look at it as it's a sponge that's housing chazer, okay? Or you could look at it as the piece of heter itself becomes iser. So I'll tell you a practical ramification. You have a 10-ounce piece of chazer that gets cooked, a 1-ounce piece of chazer that gets cooked with a 10-ounce kosher steak. So you can't eat the steak anyway because it got cooked with the 1-ounce chazer. And there's no shishim. The question is, though, how do you look at this heter? How do you look at this piece of steak? If you say chaticha nasis nevela, that means that the steak itself becomes iser. That would mean that if this 10-ounce steak that got cooked with a 1-ounce chazer falls into another pot, how much in that third pot would I need? So you have the first pot, right? The first pot is the chazer, 1 ounce, cooks with a 10-ounce steak. So the steak becomes aser. Then I pick up the steak and I drop it into a second pot accidentally. How much in the second pot do I need to nullify the steak? If you say chaticha nasis nevela, that means that the 10 ounces become iser. That means that I need 60 times 10. I need 600 ounces in the second one. If you say chaticha loy nasis nevela, that means that the iser, that the chazer is just housed in the heter, but the heter does not become iser. How can the heter become iser? It doesn't become iser. Therefore, it's just housing 1 ounce in it. Then, if it were to fall into another pot, you would just need 60 ounces to nullify it, because that original 1 ounce goes out into the 60 ounces. That's the fundamental shaila of whether you say chaticha, nasis nevela or not. So let's explain. Darish Rabbi Chana says, chaticha shel nevela b'shel dag tamei. Let's say you have a slice of nevela. So you have a slice of cow that's not kosher, because it wasn't shechted properly. So you have one steak that falls into a pot of other steaks and liquid. So it falls into a pot of steaks and liquid. So the halacha is like this. The halacha is, we look at the entire pot and say, is there shishim corresponding to the original iser? If there's shishim, the entire pot, that includes you can count you have a original iser, nevela, that falls into 20 steaks with liquid and onions and carrots, all these things. So you figure out shishim. Here's how you figure it out. You look at all the steaks, you look at the liquid, you look at the carrots, all of it together. If it's shishim corresponding to the original iser, then everything's mutter, and if not, then we have a problem. Now, there are 2 chidushim here. Chidush number 1 is that although we paskin, at least in times of the Gemara, they paskin, mim b'mino is not batal. So over here you'll say, well, once there's an original iser and it falls into other steaks, that's mim b'mino, the whole thing should be a problem. Not so true. Because there is water here also, and carrots, which are eino mino, it's a mixture of min, the original iser, with mino, other heterim that are the same type, and eino mino. And the halacha is that we do have nullification in such a situation. Okay, the Gemara will address exactly the details. Chiddush number 2, and this is the bigger chiddush. The Gemara understands the case is as follows. You have the original steak, iser, that falls into 5 steaks, yeah, and it has liquid. Or 20 steaks, and it has liquid also. The Gemara understands the cases as follows. It's not just where you have 20 steaks with liquid and the iser falls in. It's not so simple. The case could also be the original iser falls into a pot with 1 steak. Then, after they cook together, then the other steaks fall in and the liquid. And still we say shishim. Now the chiddush is, we do not say chanan. See, if you say chanan, that means that when that original iser cooked with that one steak becomes iser. And now all of a sudden, in order to nullify it, I need to double it. I don't just need, in the end mixture, to be corresponding to the original iser, shishim. I need shishim corresponding to the original iser and the steak that cooked with it. The fact that Rabbi Bar Chana doesn't mention that, because Rabbi Bar Chana believes there's no such thing as chanan. In which case, although it was in stages, you have the original iser cooking with 1 steak, and then all the other steaks fall in, it doesn't matter. The original iser did not change that 1 steak into iser. That 1 steak was just housing iser. More steaks fall in, it distributes equally, and everything's fine. So in other words, according to Rabbi Bar Chana, we don't say chanan, in which case, all of the that original steak that was cooking with the 1 iser, because we assume that it's even that case. So you have 1 iser A with steak A, heter A. That steak heter does not become iser, and therefore even if subsequently when others fall in, you only need shishim corresponding to the original iser. That's Rabbi Chana's opinion. So says the Gemara, Uki Rav Amayra Alevadarish. Rav heard this, and he got someone, he had a spokesperson to announce publicly that he disagreed. And he said, Kivan shenas and tam b'chaticha, once the original iser nevela cooked with that 1 steak becomes iser as well. Chaticha achasma nasas nevela, v'yiseres kol chatichas kulam neishemina. And then once that's true, then the original iser and the 1 steak cause problems to the entire dish. In other words, you don't just need shishim corresponding to the original iser, you need shishim corresponding to the original iser and the steak that are cooked with it. And if it doesn't have Isser, then min b'mino, it's a problem. Okay. So says the Gemara, I get it. But here's my one question. What was Rav's point of being strict? Rav's point is you have the Isser Nevela that cooks with one or two steaks that are mutter. Aser is the one or two steaks. So now you actually have the Isser is sort of multiplying. You have the original Isser plus the steaks that are cooked with it. Now they're all Aser. And then when stuff falls in, it's going to be a problem. It's not batal because min b'mino. Let me just ask you a question. If the problem is min b'mino, then why do you need chanan at all? Once you have the original Isser that's with the steaks, it's not nullified anyway. It's min b'mino, not batal. Why is it worse? It's like, Rab's point is, oh no, it's worse in this case because you have the original Isser and then it cooked with other steaks and it made the other steaks Aser. But once you hold min b'mino, not batal, you don't need more. It doesn't matter the size. It's like, oh no, the original Isser is now bigger. Who cares? Once the original Isser, once you say min b'mino, the original Isser is never batal. So what does it matter that it got cooked with heterim and now the Isurim are bigger or more grand or doubled in size? Who cares? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Safla Baya Michti, Rav Kaman Amar Shmaita. Who is Rav following? Rav Yehuda Amar min b'mino lo batal. Rav follows the view of Rav Yehuda, min b'mino is not batal. So Ma'ir Yikonos in time. If that's the case, then once you have the original Isser that's there, it'll cause a problem. Who cares? Chanan, no Chanan, it doesn't make a difference. Afilu kilonas and tam nami. Once you have the original Isser there, it's a problem. It doesn't matter. Once you say min b'mino is not batal, why is it worse that you say Chanan? Even if you don't say Chanan, it's going to be a problem. Why does Chanan change anything? So the Gemara says, Amar le, hachamay eskina b'shekad v'silik. The case is, the original Isser was removed. I mean, the Isser fell in with one steak, and then the original Isser was removed. Then the other steaks fell in. So if you don't say Chanan, then it will be batal. Min b'mino does not apply when the original Isser is gone. It's gone. So if you say Chanan, that means that when the Isser was cooking with the original, the kosher steak, it made the steak Aser, then it continues the problem. The case is specifically where the Isser was removed. So if you say Chanan, then the Shaila continues. If you don't say Chanan, the Isser is removed, it's gone. And then once you say the Isser is gone, then the Shaila is done. But if you say Chanan, then the Heter becomes Isser, and the Shaila continues. That's why he had to mention Chanan. Rava Omar, Rava says a different shot. Go to the next page. Even if the original Isser is there. So the question is again, you have the original Isser that cooked with one steak, and then the other steaks fell in with the liquid, all that stuff. So we're saying in the Gemara, Rav said it's a problem because the original Isser cooks with the original Heter, doubling its size, and then it creates an issue. So the question is why? Once you say min b'mino is not batal, it's going to be Aser because the original steak. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because over here, you have the original steak with other steaks, and you have a liquid. The rule is that when you have Isser, min, with Heter, that's the same type, and Einomino, so you have min, b'mino, ve'einomino, the rule is like this. So you have a piece of the steak that's also the nevela. Then you have the heterim steaks, and then you have the liquid. So the nevela against the heterim steaks, they're not batal, because min, b'mino. But here's the way we look at it. We isolate the original Isser with the liquid. It's a big heter that we actually say, let's split the shaila up into two parts. Instead of original Isser, heter, steaks, and liquid, let's just do liquid against the original Isser. Min and einomino. If they're shishim, shaila is done, everything's mutter. Then we reintroduce the heter steaks. That's what we do first. So the reason why it's important to know whether the original Isser is the same size or whether because of Chanan it doubled in size is because in such a situation, we look at the original Isser, the Heter, and then the other liquids, the liquids, we look at the liquids against the original Isser. Figure out the ratio. If it's Shishim, the whole thing's mutter. So I have to know how big the original Isser is. If the original Isser cooked with another Heter, it doubled in size, then I take those two against the liquid. So the reason why I have to know is because the way it works is when you have min, b'mino, v'she'enomino, we isolate the Isser with enomino. We have the game of war, who wins. If the enomino is 60 times bigger, then the whole thing's mutter. So you have to know how big the original Isser is. If you say Chanan, the original Isser is double. Says the Gemara, have a min, b'mino, v'davar acher, v'chol min, b'mino, v'davar acher, salak es mina k'she'eno, v'she'en mino, rabba lava mevatlo. Okay. Zak the new Mishnah, noyig b'tahira. The gidanasha only applies to kosher animals. There is no gidanasha on non-kosher animals. Rav Yehuda disagrees. He says, af b'tmeya. Rav Yehuda says, no, even a non-kosher animal, there's an isser of gidanasha. Now, by the way, the one point the Gemara is going to deal with, and this will take us to the end of the daf, is that you have a non-kosher animal, a chazer, which is already aser because of chazer, but the gid anosha is also aser because of gid anosha. That's called iser chalal iser. That you have the original iser of chazer, and the iser of gid anosha is chal on top of it. Rav Yehuda, I'll prove it to you that chazer is the same halachas of gid anosha. When was gid anosha given? When Yaakov fought the Malach. At that point, they weren't Jews yet. Therefore, they were allowed to eat chazer, the Shvatim. So because the Shvatim, from the perspective of the Shvatim, chazer and cows were all the same, so obviously gid anosha applies to all animals, because it was given to Bnei Noach. They were given to the Shvatim, who were not Jews yet. So it must be gid anosha applies to non-kosher animals as well. To that, the Tanakama disagrees, who says, no, it only applies to kosher animals. What about the fact that it was given to Yaakov Avinu before the Torah was given? So they did not have the status of Jews. They said to him, B'sinai nemar el shenichtav b'kaimei. The truth is, the Isser of gid anosha was actually given after Har Sinai. It's written in Parashas Vayishlach because nichtav b'kaimei. It was written there, but it was only actually given after Har Sinai. So it was only given after Har Sinai when the laws of kashrus were also given, and therefore it only applies to kosher animals. Okay, just to finish up the daf, the Gemara is dealing with the fact that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Isser gid anosha applies to non-kosher animals, and it's Isser chalal Isser, pashtos. It means that there's an Isser of chazer, and on top of chazer, the gid anosha is chal. B'sav Rabbi Yehuda Isser chalal Isser. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold of Isser chalal Isser? That's such a thing that you could have the Isser gid anosha being chal onto chazer. But Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, didn't Rabbi Yehuda say, we know that a kosher bird that dies transmits tumah in your mouth when you eat it. Non-kosher birds are not like that. So Rabbi Yehuda says, how do I know that if I eat a non-kosher bird that it does not cause tumah by swallowing it without touching it, meaning without touching the outside of your body, just touches the mouth, the inside of your mouth? How do I know that non-kosher birds do not transmit tumah? Because we know non-kosher birds are already aser. So that means that the tumah of kosher birds only applies to one that there is an isur of only nevela, but non-kosher birds which have other isurim, this is not chal. In other words, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda says, we know that there's a tumah nevela, there's a tumas nevela from kosher birds. How do I know it doesn't apply to non-kosher birds? Because it only applies to someone that the Isser is nevela, as opposed to non-kosher birds which have other Isurim. What do you see? See, the non-kosher birds don't have the Isser nevela. Why? Any bird that has the Isser nevela is matama by swallowing. If you eat a non-kosher bird, you eat an eagle, it's not matama. Why? Because there's no Isser nevela on an eagle. What's the Isser? Non-kosher bird. What about nevela as well? Ein Isser chalal Isser. So Yeshir of Yehuda does not hold the Isser chalal Isser. So says the Gemara. So basically, in other words, how do you have? He holds that if you eat a chazer's gid anosha, you're over gid anosha and chazer, but it's ein Isser chalal Isser. So says the Gemara. V'chi tema kasaver ein begidim nosin tam ubetzmei nami Isser gid ika Isser tumaleka. Maybe he holds that gid anosha does not have flavor, in which case it's not considered a part of the chazer. So the only isser is gid anosha, not chazer, right? You're only usher for eating chazer of parts that have flavor, that are considered basar. If the gid anosha does not have flavor, it's not considered a piece of chazer. So the only isser is gid anosha. So it's not isser chal isser. Maybe there is no flavor on a gid anosha, so it's not chazer as well. So it's only gid anosha. The problem is, Rabbi Yehuda, the Brisa says, Rav Shimon Paiter, Rabbi Yehuda says, if you eat the chazer's gid anosha, you get two sets of lashes, one for chazer, one for gid anosha. So it must be that there's an isser chal isser, but I thought Rabbi Yehuda does not hold isser chal isser. So the Gemara says, Lo'elam kasavar yesh begid anoisin tam. Kasavar noig b'shlil, the isser gid anosha, the isser tumah b'hadi adadikasi. Perhaps it's not isser chal isser, but rather they're both happening at the same time in utero. In utero, you have the Isser of gid anosha, and you have the Isser of chazer in utero. So because they're happening at the same time, it's not Isser chal Isser. The Gemara is going to have two issues. First of all, second of all, eventually the Gemara is going to point out that the flesh of the animal in the utero develops before the sinews are developed. So actually the Isser is first, and then gid anosha. I mean, chazer first, then gid anosha. But the Gemara assumes, let's say it happen at the same time. And they're both happening when in the mother's womb. Is that true? I thought Rav Yehuda's shita is that if you shecht a 9-month-old, you shecht an animal and you find a 9-month-old baby in there, you could eat the ginanasha, because the Issa ginanasha is not chal in utero. And when you shecht it in utero, it's ki'ilu, it's still in utero. Vatanan, the Mishnah says, noyig b'shlil, the ginanasha applies to a fetus. Rav Yehuda Omer, eino noyig b'shlil. Rav Yehuda says it does not apply to a fetus v'chalvei mutter. So you see that Rav Yehuda holds that there is no isser of ginanasha when it's in utero. So how could you say it's happening at the same time? By chazer. It doesn't apply. The ginanasha does not apply when it's a fetus. Says the Gemara, hani mili gabi tahira. Derchmana called b'beima techelu. Avol tmei noyig. Maybe it only applies in utero by a chazer, but not by a kosher animal. Kosher animal, there is no ginanasha in utero, only by a non-kosher animal. The problem is, we have a major issue. You can't tell me they're happening at the same time. What's your whole premise? It's not Isser Chal Isser, because they're happening at the same time. In the mother's womb, in the animal's womb, you have the Isser of ginanasha and the Isser of chazer happening at the same time. It's not true. The Isser of chazer comes first. How do I know this? These are the types of tumah that will cause a nazir to have to redo his tumah. In other words, these are tummy mace, ala mace, on a dead body, a whole corpse, or on a kazayis. The kashalam, we had this comment recently, and the question was obvious. Al kazayis menames megaleach, al mace kulei kol sheken. If you're already megaleach on a kazayis, kavachayim you're megaleach on the entire mace. So why do you have to tell me the entire body and kazayis? It's pashut. The answer is, there's two separate cases. There's a tumah kazayis of a mace, or there's an entire dead body that's less than a kazayis. How do you have a dead body less than a kazayis? A fetus of a baby that the ivarim are there, but there's no sinews holding it together. So the entire thing is less than a kazayis. And imatama, what do you see? You see from this is that the ivarim are already developed before the sinews are developed to hold it together. So over here in the animal stomach, the ivarim are developing of the chazer. So it's already asim mitzad chazer without the ginanasha. So it's not happening at the same time. The ginanasha happens afterwards. So you're back to the original problem. What about isser chal isser? The Gemara answers, af al gav the isser tuma kadim, asi isser gid chayal layush ken isser no b'neinach. The answer is, you're right, it is isser chal isser. But Rabbi Yehuda allows isser chal isser if the second isser is more advanced and is stronger and is more applicable. Because the Isser of Chazer only applies to Jews, but the Isser of Ginanasha, he believes, applies to Goyim as well. Rav Yehuda's shita is that Goyim are not allowed to eat the Ginanasha. So because the Isser Ginanasha applies to both Yidden and Goyim, the second Isser is more koilul, and therefore there is Isser Chalul Isser. Dekanami Tani Amar Rav Yehuda V'alei b'nei Yaakov Nesa b'nei Ginanasha V'adayin Behemat Tmeim U'Tereslam. The Lashon also alludes to this. Rav Yehuda said that the Ginanasha applies to Bnei Yaakov, meaning they were non-Jews. So you see that Rav Yehuda's shita is the Ginanasha applies to Goyim as well. So because it applies to Jews and Goyim, it's more of an Isser Koilel, and therefore we say Isser Chal al Isser. All right, we'll stop here.